The history of Indian civilization is usually narrated in terms of the rise and fall of various political empires. This cyclic process has continuously shaped the geographic boundaries of Indian civilization. Into this ferment were added new cultural streams coming from other civilizations. The Turkish invasion from Central Asia brought in the Islamic culture, creating its own political empires in India. While India was struggling to contain and assimilate the Islamic culture in its political processes, the rising powers of European culture were finding their way into India. Eventually, European colonization led to the formation of the British Raj in India. With this colonization came scientific materialism and the Christian missionaries of European culture. This shook the very foundations of Indian civilization, setting in motion a new awakening. With this awakening came the rebirth of India as a modern nation-state. The post-independence era saw the accelerating process of globalization. And with the arrival of the internet, the cultural streams from around the world are entering and mixing with the Indian civilization. At the same time, the ideas of the ancient Indian civilization are spreading across the world. The celebration of the International Yoga Day is an Indian contribution to the emerging global civilization. But what is the essential vision and work of India among the global community of nations today? To know this, we must be cognizant of the vision and work of the Indian civilization that had been unfolding over many millennia. Behind the apparently random series of political empire-building cycles, there is an emerging process of evolving consciousness. Linking them together into a meaningful whole. The evolution of consciousness implies a collective conscious being within a civilization. This being is going through the process of its birth and growth through generations of people across the empires. A spiritual history must trace and reveal this process. The earliest memories of the Indian civilization can be traced to the Vedas of the Bronze Age. The Vedic mantras are not a product of reasoning intellect, but of intuition. According to Sri Aurobindo, in India, the reign of intuition came first before intellectual development. The Vedic mantras are still preserved in its ancient form as an unbroken living continuity. It is in the Vedic experience we can find the birth and childhood of the Indian civilization. The Vedic rishis had already discovered the spiritual reality beyond the material facade. And they had also discovered the process of accelerating their spiritual evolution. This conscious and evolutionary transformation of their own being enabled them to access higher consciousness and its corresponding powers. They laid the seed ideas of the Indian civilization. The Vedic age was followed by a descending movement of consciousness, which attempted to take up each lower degree of consciousness and link it to the spiritual summit. In this historic process, after the Vedas came the early Upanishads. The Upanishadic rishis reaffirmed and restated the Vedic knowledge, but in new forms. They laid the foundations of Vedanta. While their methods were still intuitive, their expressions had already become increasingly intellectual. This was the period when the Indian civilization reached its adulthood. This period was followed by the Age of Reason. With the Age of Reason came a great outburst of intellectual development, flowering into 6 systems of philosophy and 2 great religions. They took spiritual truth as its basis and tried to reach it by the power of the mind's reflective, speculative, logical thought. At the same time, the processes of yoga were developed, which spiritualized the thinking mind. This period also saw the birth of 2 great epics, Ramayana and Mahabharata. Valmiki and Vyasa, the most influential poets of ancient India, took up the essence of the Vedic and Upanishadic experience and recast them into new forms suitable for the Age of Reason. The Gita of Mahabharata brought in a new synthesis of knowledge. The consciousness came down further, leading to increasing codification and systematization of knowledge of that era. As consciousness came down further, the emotional and aesthetic being was taken up as the means of spiritual realization. This gave birth to the Puranic period and Bhakti movements, spiritualizing the emotional being in the individual through the heart and its emotions. This period saw the birth of temples and deity worship. They revived and restated the ancient truths of the Vedas in terms of devotional poetry. Further descent of consciousness led to the development of Tantra, which took up the aspect of power and pleasure and turned them towards spiritualization. This period saw the proliferation of massive temple architecture and related tantric methods of occult sciences. There was a vast expansion of Indian culture across Asia. As the descending movement continued, the Hatha Yoga emerged, which took up the body and its spiritualization. This was India's entry into the physical consciousness and the plunge into its subconscious regions. Then began the withdrawal of the Indian civilization from its outgoing expansion of the previous tantric cycle. The civilization entered the dream state of sleep and its corresponding illusionism, which denied and neglected the existence of the material reality. It is during this stage of inertia of the inward absorption that the foreign invasions came to India. The powerful force of materialism that came from the West shook India out of slumber. The newly awakened India is recovering her true being. The recovery of the old spiritual knowledge and experience in all its splendor, depth and fullness is her first, most essential work. The flowing of this spirituality into new forms of philosophy, literature, art, science and critical knowledge is the second step. An original dealing with modern problems in the light of the Indian spirit and the endeavor to formulate a greater synthesis of a spiritualized society is the third and most difficult work. Indian civilization's success on these three lines will be the measure of India's contribution to the future of humanity. India has always existed for humanity and not for herself. And it is for humanity and not for herself that she must be great. In India, the most ancient records of spiritual self-discovery can be found in the Vedas. The Vedic seers boldly declared that behind the many forces of nature worshipped by man, there is one self, one being, one consciousness, one existence. And we are one with that greater self, immortal and deathless behind the multiplicity of forms. This experiential realization was accessible to anyone who was willing to embark upon the path of self-discovery. And the seekers who had arrived at such a self-realization were called the Rishis. They guided the destiny of people, their kings, kingdoms, and the growth towards larger empires. They laid the foundations of Indian culture. But how old are the Vedas? The orthodox scholars position it around 1500 BCE. But the Vedic rishis speak of themselves as new seers, and refer back to their own ancient seers who preceded them and found the path to self-realization. This makes it difficult to clearly demarcate the time period of the Vedic age and the antiquity of its systems of knowledge. The Vedic experience was orally transmitted across generations, encoded as mantras. Sri Aurobindo refers to this ancient mantric language as Deva Bhasha, in which the creative power of the word was central. The rishis were the discoverers of the Vedic mantras. They did not intellectually compose them. They discovered the flame of aspiration, the Agni, arising from their innermost depths, and gave it utterance in life as mantras. The rhythmic words of immense transformative power, an utterance that was one with the innate processes of nature. This Agni, this flame of aspiration, was not only within themselves, but they saw it everywhere in nature, carrying forward a mysterious process of evolution in nature towards higher ranges of consciousness. Following the ascending path of Agni, they could discover and open to the descending power of Indra, of a divine mind above. And with it, the immense powers of self-transformation, a process that was at once a journey and a battle, ascending to higher planes of existence and receiving into themselves greater powers of consciousness. Beyond the material nature, they mapped the 7 planes of consciousness. It is in the Vedas we find the earliest references to the supermind, the Mahas or the Vijnana, or in Sri Aurobindo's modern language, the truth consciousness. It was this plane of consciousness that linked the formless oneness above and the world of forms and multiplicity below. It was the dynamic foundation of oneness and multiplicity of creation held together in a vast harmony of truth consciousness. They mapped the ascending pathways to this sun world. It was their psycho-spiritual process of self-discovery and self-transformation. A process they referred to as yajna, a universal process of evolutionary transformation in nature, at once subjective and objective, which brought not only spiritual wealth but also material wealth and abundance. Their knowledge was encrypted in the living symbols of their mantric language, accessible only to those who were psychologically fit to handle the immense powers that it gave them. The mantras revealed their true meanings and powers only to those who could evolve to become the seers themselves. For the rest of the society, these mantras and yajnas remained as a means of gaining material prosperity. It was the age of intuition in India, the age of mysteries, the earliest dawn of spiritual awakening and evolutionary transformation of human nature.
Réjouissons-nous, car la folie que nous vivons est une illusion qui force de plus en plus de gens à s'éveiller. Cependant, nous devons avoir de la compassion pour ceux qui sont incapables de s'éveiller, parce que l'injection d'ARNM a créé une séparation avec l'âme individuelle. La seule façon de sortir de l'illusion est la non-conformité absolue. Je ne suis pas intéressé par la survie qui mène à une mort inévitable avec réincarnation dans cette simulation de réalité virtuelle. Je choisis de vivre à tout prix. Les plus courageux ont désormais consciemment choisi de sortir de l'illusion et continueront l'évolution de conscience sur la spirale ascendante de cristal. Pensez à visionner les nombreuses vidéos que j'ai créées sur les spirales des ondes temporelles. Je sais que mon expérience en prison était une bénédiction, car elle m'a forcé à quitter le Canada et ce qui était perçu comme une vie parfaite de dentiste très prospère et de mère de 2 merveilleux enfants. J'ai accédé au courage en moi. Je me suis abandonné à mon âme et j'ai sauté dans l'inconnu complet. Aujourd'hui, je suis en mesure d'offrir des conseils à ceux qui choisissent de vivre en Colombie ou Équateur. Un séjour de longue durée aux cascades à Café Retiro coûte 400 $ par mois. Je propose également des soins dentaires reconstructifs à un prix très abordable. Enfin, je suis guidé par les enseignements de Sri Aurobindo et de la mère. Le yoga intégral de Sri Aurobindo va au-delà de la libération individuelle et entreprend une transformation collective sur Terre. Après le décès de Sri Aurobindo, la mère poursuivit leur travail et le 29 février 1956, elle amena dans l'atmosphère terrestre la conscience supramentale sur Terre. Depuis, le supramental agit sur Terre comme un pouvoir actif d'évolution. Une nouvelle phase d'évolution a commencé au milieu de l'effondrement du vieux monde. Le yoga intégral vous convie à une aventure de conscience sans précédent. Veux-tu nous rejoindre? Amour infini.